Well, welcome. Here we are for English 3328, the survey of British literature, which begins at the end of the 18th and beginning of the 19th century, and then comes down to the present time. So what we're going to be doing in this course is we're going to begin with one of the major cultural transitions in our history, with the emergence of Romanticism. And we'll be talking a good deal about that this evening, but also a great deal about it for the next couple of meetings. And we're going to be reading a number of the most important Romantic poets, some of whom you no doubt have read before, at least in part, and some of whom may be new to you and may be a real surprise in the sense that you may find out some people whom you would like to continue with and spend some more time with. And then we're going to be moving into the major Victorian writers and talking about the kind of culture that was developing in the middle to later 19th century, which of course carries on into the early part of the 20th century. And I should pause and make this comment now, and I'll probably have to make this again and again, but when we're talking about any kind of history, and here of course talking about something like cultural history, you can't come up with absolute defining lines. You know, so when we say the literature of the 18th century is characterized by such and such features, or Romantic literature is characterized by such and such features, and that really is dominant in the early part of the 19th century, though in many ways its influences continue for a very long time in the 19th and on into the 20th centuries. So that people didn't wake up on January 1st, 1800 and all of a sudden find themselves in a new world, obviously. That's not the way history works, and it certainly is not the way cultural history works. So when I give you these broad senses of time and of periods and so forth, remember now that this is simply a convenient way of talking about certain times in which there were certain elements in dominance. But there may also have been lots of older traditions that were still going on at that time, and maybe among many, many people, and having very important influences, but there were now new forces that were coming into dominance. And if we were to look far enough in the future, we might even begin to see some hints of something yet to come. So that when we're talking about history, we're talking about something which is much more fluid than our usual ways of establishing categories would suggest. But once again, when we talk about the Romantics, we're talking about a kind of cultural movement that came into dominance in the early part of the 19th century, though we can already see certain features of Romanticism beginning to emerge in the 18th century. And of course, many features of Romanticism are going to continue on down to the present day, even though they are no longer dominant in our culture in the way that they were 150 years ago or thereabouts. So we will, as I said, also be looking at the major Victorians, and we'll be talking a lot about the kinds of things that were happening not only in Victorian England, but I'm also going to be talking about how these cultural events had an impact on the United States as well. Because especially during the earlier periods, what was happening in England frequently was also happening in the United States. Maybe not at the same time, but we often find that a movement will start in England and then it will be brought over either by immigrants from England or elsewhere to the American colonies and then to the young American Republic, or simply by virtue of a kind of cultural transmission from one place to another, from the old world to what then was called the New World. And eventually we're going to be working our way into a discussion of modernism, which begins to emerge a little bit before World War I, just to give you kind of a convenient dating time, and then of course comes into dominance after World War I, and certainly until late in the 20th century, by which time other factors are beginning to come into play, and we enter into something that, for want of a better term, is often called postmodernism, which is the stage that many of us find ourselves in today. Does that mean that we have totally left behind some of the features of earlier cultural moments that we're going to be talking about in this class? Certainly not. And some of the issues that were burning issues to people in the 19th century are still very important issues to us today. But to some extent, the stage has shifted. Some of the players have shifted. Some of the settings have shifted. And so we're going to be talking about those kinds of things. What continues, what gets supplanted, how these transitions take place, and try to understand the development of our modern world, or our contemporary world, as it has emerged out of these forces from the last couple of hundred years. And along the way, we're going to be talking to a certain extent about history. We'll have to talk about great events, great historical events. Things like the Industrial Revolution, which we'll be talking about a little bit later on. We'll be talking about things like the French Revolution. We'll be talking about some of the great religious movements of the 19th century, all of which have a very, very important impact on the literature. So that as we study the literature, we're going to be looking at literary works in their historical contexts. Literary works do not come out of a kind of vacuum. They are not simply springing full grown from the brow of some genius who has absolutely no influences on her or him. They grow out of cultural contexts, and they are created within certain cultural contexts, and for people living within certain cultural contexts who choose to receive them or not to receive them with favor at different times, given the kind of context that we're talking about. So that means we're going to have to talk a certain amount about political history, social history, religious history, economic history, just history. So, nonetheless, I should stress the fact that this is, after all, a literature class. And so our primary emphasis is always going to be on the literature. However, when we're talking about people like Wordsworth, say, one of the things that Wordsworth was very much influenced by was the French Revolution. So we have to make at least some kind of reference to what that meant. Where was Wordsworth in terms of his connections with France? What happened to him as an Englishman who found himself not only sympathizing with the French in many ways, but then finding his own native country of England at war with France. And this caused a terrible crisis in his life. And you see, that kind of crisis, which profoundly influenced his career as a poet and the kind of poetry that he wrote, that can only really be understood within a specific kind of historical and social context. So that's the kind of thing that I'm talking about here. Now, I'd like to talk a little bit just about the kinds of things that you all need to know about how we're going to be proceeding. So if we can go to the PowerPoint slides now, please. Since this is a distance education class in which I am sitting right now with a group of students, who are here with me, physically with me, and you're going to be seeing them, those of you who are taking the course at a distance. You're going to be seeing these students from time to time and be hearing from them as they ask questions or make comments. But this is essentially a distance education class which is being videotaped for showing to those of you who are taking this course at a distance, either by watching the classes on television or by watching them on DVDs, either here in the main library at the University of Houston or by purchasing those DVDs. And so let me tell everyone, both the students who are here with me and those of you taking the course at a distance, how to get a hold of me. Here is my email address. And I check my email pretty much every day, not quite every day, but pretty much every day. So that's a convenient way to get a hold of me. This is my telephone number, not my home number, but my office number. And you can leave a message for me at any time if you wish. If you have some brilliant idea or question that occurs to you at 3 o'clock on Sunday morning, you can call me and you can tell me about it. Share the experience with me if you wish. I can't promise to be in my office at 3 o'clock on Sunday morning, but I can get the message afterwards and I can call you back. And my office is, as you can see here, in 235B of the Roy Cullen building, which most people know of simply as the English department, because the English department occupies all of that building. So, here's my mailing address. And I give you my mailing address because, as you will see a little bit later on, I have certain assignments that I'm going to be asking you to turn in. And some of those can be turned in by email, but some of them will have to be either hand-delivered to me or mailed in. So here is the mailing address, just my name with Department of English, University of Houston. You don't need any street numbers or anything like that because the zip code 77204 is unique to the University of Houston. And then the 3013 is for the English department. That's the mail stop for the English department. Okay? There is also an assistant instructor with the course, and this is someone who has a PhD or who is very close to a PhD in English and who's taught for quite a number of years and has worked with me in these classes before and is very experienced in working with these classes. And this person's name and email address may be found in the course description online. And for those of you who are physically here with me, I will give you all of that in a printed form. But for those of you who are taking the course at a distance, you'll be able to get that information online or during the orientation sessions at the beginning of the semester for distance education courses. And so you may contact the assistant instructor about assignments, scheduling problems, and so forth. What I mean by that are the routine issues that come up. You know, when do we have to have this in? Is it possible if something is due on Friday for me to get it in on Monday because I have such and such problem? You know, those kinds of things can be taken care of by the assistant instructor who actually keeps the folders for each one of the students. And so the assistant instructor is the one who actually has not only the folders, but also the up-to-date records on each student and when things are turned in and so forth. Okay? The required texts are the Norton Anthology of English Literature, Volume 2. Make sure you get Volume 2, because there's also a Volume 1. Volume 1 is the one that begins in the early Middle Ages and goes down through the end of the 18th century, and that's the textbook that I use in the first half of this course. Remember that British Literature Survey, English 3327 and 3328, is really 2 semesters. Now, don't get alarmed. You don't have to take both semesters in order to get credit for the course that you're currently enrolled in. But if you want to, there is the other course with the other half of the story. And many students who take one half, such as the one that you're taking now, very much may want to go back and take the other half so that they get the full narrative. There are students here with me this evening who have taken the first half with me and are now here for the second half. So, Norton Anthology of English Literature, Volume 2, the edition that is current at the time we are taping is the 7th edition, but it really doesn't make any difference. If you're using the 6th edition, that's perfectly fine. If you can get it more cheaply than the 7th edition, that's fine. You can even go back to the 5th edition, and that would be fine too, though there might be a work here or there that you would want to Xerox from you know, a current edition in the library or some other place, one of the other students in the class. Okay, but these different editions of the Norton Anthology have not changed that much from one edition to another. So, Dickens' Hard Times, Charles Dickens' famous novel, Hard Times, we're going to be taking up around the middle of the semester. And everybody's heard of Dickens, right? Well, this is one of his most interesting works. And this is also a famous and widely published work. And if you can find a secondhand copy of it in one of the bookstores that sells such editions, and you can save yourself a little bit of money, I'm always in favor of saving you money. You know, I've had kids of my own in college. Of course, I had the same kind of issues when I was going to college myself, you know, having to scramble to get the money to buy the books. So anything you can do to make things a little bit easier on your pocketbook, the better. And the same is true with Virginia Woolf's novel, Mrs. Dalloway. We'll be reading this about 3/4 of the way through the semester. So once again, if you're a little strapped right now for funds, go ahead and get the anthology and hold off on getting the Dickens and the Woolf novels until a little bit later on when we're closer to the time when we're going to be studying them here in class. Okay? And Virginia Woolf's work, you know, that's very well known, and that's, you know, widely available and should easily be available in secondhand copies. And of course, it's in high school libraries and public libraries and everywhere. There was even a movie version done of it just a few years ago, which is actually quite a good movie, by the way. The broadcast tape schedule does not really apply to students who are here with me right now, but be sure to set your VCR if you're taping the class off the air at the times designated. And usually what will happen, like this particular semester, is that classes are broadcast on Thursday morning. Well, that for most people is really Wednesday night, you know, because it's early Thursday morning. When these classes are broadcast is usually after the channels have completed their regular programming, and they would otherwise simply have dead air in the night. And so we broadcast educational television classes on the educational channels, not only our own Channel 8 here at the University of Houston, but also a couple of other educational channels here in the greater Houston area. And so, you know, one always has to be careful about that. So, you know, if it's Thursday, that's really Wednesday night and very early Thursday morning. If you miss taping a class, and this is also true for those of you who are here with me, if you happen to miss a class, God help you, Uh, you can always go and view that class in the current journals room here in the main library at the University of Houston. And there's a set of, I think they're now doing them in DVDs. They used to do them in VHS format, but I think they're now doing them all in DVDs. And so you can go upstairs for us here to the current journals room and go in there, and you can see there's a whole area where they have distance education classes, VHS tapes, and DVDs. And they have DVD players, VHS players with monitors right there in that room. And so you can simply take the DVD, pop it in, and watch the class. So, and you can even purchase the tapes. I'm not trying to promote that. I don't make any money off of that. So, you know, I don't have any particular interest in your buying them, but some people find it convenient to buy the tapes. So that's also a possibility. If you wish actually to meet with me, the professor, and or the assistant instructor, you can always call or email for an appointment at the office. And I can't give you an exact office hour right now because that will vary from semester to semester. And this tape is going to be playing for a number of semesters, and no doubt my hour will shift from year to year or from semester to semester. But you can always call for an appointment, and I'll be happy to meet with you personally if that would be helpful to you, or we can talk on the telephone, or you can talk with me or the assistant instructor, by the way, through email as well. The term paper is going to be one of the major assignments in the course, and so let me say a few words about it now. This is all in the course description and syllabus, by the way, but let me say a few words about it now. The term paper is going to be on one of the Victorian issues. Victorian issues is a section here in our textbook. It's about the middle of our textbook, and it's called Victorian Issues. And it's a series of cultural issues which were of special importance and special prominence during the middle and later 19th century, though once again, as I said at the beginning of our class this evening, history is much too fluid to set up lines of demarcation between periods and dates and so forth in any absolute way. So that the first of these issues is evolution, which brings up a whole crisis about religion and science. It's not simply evolution. But there were huge debates in the 19th century, and those debates go on into the 20th century, and they now are still going on in the 21st century over science and religion, and focusing not entirely on questions of evolution, but in part they come up through the discussion of evolution. I mean, even right now, we have groups who go to the State Board of Education and appear before textbooks committees to make presentations that certain views should or should not be included in our science textbooks that are used in our public schools. Well, those kinds of concerns go all the way back into the 19th century. And so we'll see where some of those debates come from, how the debates were conducted in the 19th and 20th centuries, of course. And this is one of the sections in the Victorian issues part of our textbook. Now, what that means is that if you had the textbook with you and you were to turn to that section, you would see a whole series of readings, usually short, excerpted pieces from longer works by writers who were key figures in the debate. So if you were to choose this topic, you would go through not only that section, and we're going to be going through these different sections, by the way, in one of our classes a little bit later on this semester. And I'll be explaining these things more fully then. But then you might want to apply that to one of the literary figures whom we're going to be studying. And you can write on somebody who is in our textbook, or you can write on somebody who is not in our textbook, but is a British author of the general period that we are discussing here. In other words, someone who is active in his or her literary career from 1800 onward. Not American. Somebody in the class always says, well, gee, what about, and then they'll come up with an American writer, and I say, well, you know, I mean, save that writer for your American literature course. Here, this is British literature. So it has to be someone who is British, broadly understood British, so that the person could be British in the sense of obviously English, or Irish, Scottish, I mean, that's fine too. Or in some cases, someone who was a writer in the old British Empire. In the old British Empire. There were African writers, for example, or Asian writers, and so forth, Caribbean writers, who were part of the old British Empire and who were writing really, in effect, as British subjects at the time. That can lead to some very interesting discussions. I'm going to come back to that again in a moment. But in any event, British broadly understood. Okay? The second of these Victorian issues is industrialism, which is really the Industrial Revolution. Progress or decline. Now, obviously, many people think of the Industrial Revolution as bringing us unlimited progress in technology and in the safety and security and comfort of our lives, and things are getting better and better and better through industrialization and technological achievement. And there are others who will point to what we often call the downside of this and talk to the serious problems that have come about as a result of industrialization. Yes, it's true that we have gained a lot, but we've also lost a lot too. And what we have lost also has to do with quality of life. And there was a huge debate already at the end of the 18th century and the beginning of the 19th century over things like that. Things like, well, great, you know, to have all these factories and so forth that were producing these wonderful goods relatively cheaply so that they were accessible to many more people than they had been previously. But what happened as a result? Pollution, urban crowding, the deterioration of cities, especially large segments of cities, the differentiation of people into widely differing classes so that the rich got richer and the poor got poorer. And these were also some of the consequences of the Industrial Revolution. How have we dealt with those things? What are the issues being debated and still being debated? I mean, you know, some of the things that I'm talking about right now are as timely as this morning's newspaper, right? And then thirdly, what the Victorians called, by their very quaint expression, the woman question. Well, the woman question, of course, has to do with something that also is not brand new in the 19th century. You can find 18th century writers already talking about this kind of thing, and in some rare cases, people even earlier talking about that. What about women? What about the role of women in society? And in the 19th century, this became a widely discussed issue. in what is sometimes referred to as the first wave of feminism. This was a time in which people began to say, if women are truly equal, then they have to be treated equally. And equality means, among other things, equality of opportunity, right? Equality of opportunity. And you can't have equality of opportunity without equality of education, right? And this is something that then became part of the whole reform movement in the 19th century. Not everybody agreed with it, but many reformers did agree with the proposition that women should be given the same kind of access to quality education that men had. Otherwise, they never would have the same opportunities. And if they didn't have the same opportunities, they never would have a chance to be equal to men, right? And achieve the same kind of potential that men might. And it will come as no surprise to you that until almost the end of the 19th century, women could not attend medical school and sit for examinations and receive medical doctorates. I mean, see what I'm doing is I'm just taking one area of education. I mean, you could talk about other areas of education too, but this one area of education in which obviously by excluding people from equality of access to education, you were excluding a whole group of people from equality of opportunity, right? Now, obviously, the same kind of cause has been taken up by other groups. It's become a commonplace. And it's really an idea which comes out of the Enlightenment, the so-called Enlightenment of the 18th century, but obviously comes to fruition in many ways in the 19th and 20th centuries. So that in more recent times, the same kinds of arguments have been made by African Americans, by people of color of, all different kinds of groupings and ethnicities and minorities and so forth. If we truly believe in the equality of all human beings as brothers and sisters of the earth, then it's our moral obligation, isn't it? Not simply our obligation as citizens, but it's our moral obligation to provide equality of opportunity. And the only way we can give true equality of opportunity is to give equality of education. Now, it's not quite as simple as that, of course, but that's one of the principal ways in which the whole argument has been framed. Going back into the 19th century, there are those who had very conventional stereotypes of what a woman ought to be. The nice woman, the sweet woman, the woman who never got angry, the woman who was in a phrase made famous by the title of a poem that was famous in the 19th century. The woman was supposed to be the angel in the house. Now we're going to see some writers, including women writers, by the way, who supported those kinds of stereotypes for women. And we're going to see others who are very critical of them. So that becomes a very interesting thing to look at as a theme in the literature. We've already got a bunch of things then. When we're reading a novel, does the novel have something to do with science and maybe even moral questions about science? Think about Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. What is that about? I mean, among other things, it's about science gone mad, isn't it? You see, a scientist who finds the capability of producing human life. My God, we're on the verge of that ourselves, aren't we? I mean, it was only a fantasy at the beginning of the 19th century in Mary Shelley's novel, but we're virtually there, aren't we? I mean, we already have been able to create life, right? In a certain sense of creating life. And it is virtually within our grasp to create human life. What does that mean? What does that mean? You know, what kinds of moral and philosophical considerations come into play there? What kind of religious questions come up, as a matter of fact? Those are very interesting kinds of issues. Mary Shelley is dealing with those already. Just because we have the knowledge to do something, ought we to do that thing? Ought we to do that thing? Okay? I mean, it's sort of, I mean, let's take an obvious instance of this. Just because we have the capability to exterminate all life on this planet, should we do it? Right? Just because we have the capability of incinerating vast populations, should we use that ability, that kind of knowledge, that kind of technology? You know, I mean, those are very interesting questions. In the areas of genetics and biology and so forth, once again, those issues are still very much with us. And if anything, they're even more with us today than they have been in the past, because they are now literally at our doorstep. And there are a lot of writers who in one way or another have dealt with those kinds of issues. Industrialism, once again, Dickens' Hard Times. What makes the hard times hard? It's for working class people in Victorian England. Yes, the rich got richer, and even the people of the upper middle class did very well, generally speaking. But people of the lower classes had a very, very, very hard time of it. And that's what Hard Times is really all about. I mean, it's about more than just that, but that's one of the main things that it's about. The woman question, God knows, we've got writers all over the place dealing with questions of gender and gender identity, gender relations, and so forth, because obviously it's not just about women, is it? I mean, as soon as you start reflecting on the question of women and the role of women in society, very soon you're going to have to put that in a context of men as well, right? So if we start asking about the identity, roles, and so forth for women, we very quickly are going to begin to question what are the proper roles, identities, and so forth for men. What constitutes masculinity, for example? Not only what constitutes womanliness, but what constitutes manliness. And those are very interesting issues. And the Victorians wrestled with those issues, by the way, in work after work after work after work. One of the things that we're going to see as we come into the 20th century, just to take an obvious case, is Virginia Woolf. Not only in Mrs. Dalloway, which we're going to be reading and talking about here, which again and again and again is dealing with questions of gender identity and relations between men and women, but also her famous work, A Room of One's Own, which we're going to be reading substantial portions of and talking about here as well. Okay, but in addition to that, recently there's been a great deal of interest in talking about masculinity. And what does it, I mean, see what I'm talking about is that there's a kind of dialectic here, that when you talk about the one, that's going to lead to talking about the other. So, you will not be restricted, by the way, to Victorian literature, even though I'm asking you to consider one of the issues raised by the Victorians and much discussed by the Victorians. You can do a 20th century writer, or now even 21st century writer or work, if you choose to do so. Okay? So that, for example, Virginia Woolf would be fair game. let's say. I'm not trying to promote any particular writer here. Mary Shelley, who actually comes before the Victorian debate a little bit, would be fair game because she's within our general time period. Okay, but I'm also not trying to promote women writers alone. We've got God's plenty of great men writers in this course as well. Now, what I will ask you to do is this: not to do for your paper a work that we are covering in class. Okay, so if you want to take one of the writers we are covering in class, what I'll ask you to do is work with a different novel or a different poem or a different play or whatever it is than the one that we're dealing with here in class. Okay? Or choose a writer who is not on the syllabus at all. And there are plenty of very, very interesting and important writers whom we just don't have time to include in a semester-long course like this. Okay? And I'm going to provide you with a fourth alternative. Or an alternate topic, something I touched on a little earlier, the colonial experience in the old British Empire, or the post-colonial experience in the former colonies. The colonial experience in the old British Empire. The old British Empire, if you don't know what the old British Empire consisted of, the inside cover of the current edition of the Norton Anthology is a world map with all of the old colonies of the British Empire shaded in so you can see what they are. But we have obviously vast areas in Africa, in Asia, in the subcontinent of India and Pakistan, over here, obviously in our hemisphere, in the Caribbean area particularly, and also Australia, New Zealand, and so on and so on and so on. These are all former, well, Canada too. These are all former colonies of the British in the old British Empire. So if you were to take an author who is writing out of that experience, that would be fine. Somebody who just pops into my head is E.M. Forster in his Passage to India. He is talking about the experience of being British and living in India during the colonial period. And being a person of conscience. I'm not talking about just being an exploiter who didn't care about people, but being a person of conscience. We're going to see in Conrad's case, Conrad's Heart of Darkness we're going to be taking up a little bit later on. Well, what we have is we have the white man in Africa. And what's going on? Well, a lot of horrible exploitation was going on, not only of the natural resources and physical richnesses of Africa, but also of the human beings of Africa. And that was enormously important, okay? And important for people of conscience, I'm talking about now white Europeans of conscience, to face up to. But even then, you see, there are problems, as the great African novelist Achebe has pointed out. There are certain seemingly inescapable racist structures in Conrad's work. And so we're going to be reading Conrad and Achebe, by the way, side by side, and reading Achebe's critique of Conrad's work. That's very interesting stuff. Or post-colonial. What about writers who are either of British ancestry who are still living in some of the former colonies, or people who are indigenous peoples living obviously in former British colonies and writing out of their experiences? Well, there's some really interesting kinds of things going on. Achebe being a very good case, by the way, of an African, and a native or indigenous African, writing out of the experience of someone who came from and came out of a kind of British cultural milieu as it was translated into Africa. Or to take somebody from the other side of the equation, Doris Lessing, a very famous and important woman novelist and short story writer who also spent many years in Africa as a white European, but also as a person of conscience and very sensitive to the kinds of problems that were involved in that. And so, some very, very interesting and complex issues come up with the kind of literature that I'm talking about now. And those issues were not brand new in the 20th century. We're going to see when we take up Blake. Blake is our first author, by the way. We're going to see when we take up Blake. In a poem like The Little Black Boy, Little Black Boy is a very, very interesting poem in which the little black boy becomes the speaker in the poem. And there are all kinds of incredible ironies involved in making the little black boy the speaker in the poem. Well, we'll talk about that. But this is really the end of the 18th century, beginning of the 19th century, when Blake was living and writing. So we're not talking about somebody, 150 years later. So, okay. Any questions, by the way, among any of you here about what I've been talking about? We're going to have lots more opportunities to talk about these things as we go along. And as I said, we're going to have a whole class set aside for the discussion of these issues and the texts that we have in our anthology dealing with these issues. Okay? I'm providing you with a kind of outline. I don't mean to make this a mechanical exercise, but people always want to know, well, what are you really looking for? Well, I'm suggesting a three-part structure for your paper. First, in 1.5 to 2 pages, something like that, establish the social and historical context for the issue your author is addressing. The social and historical context for the issue your author is addressing. What was going on? What are the stakes here? Then choose some work by your author. Could be a novel, could be a long short story, could be a play. If you choose shorter works, you'll probably want to take a group of shorter works, like a closely related group of poems. And you'll do that for the major part of your paper. This is your analysis now. And then sum up, thirdly, in about a paragraph, giving your assessment of your author's contribution to the particular issue. Okay, that makes sense? We're talking about a paper that's roughly 8 to 10 pages long. Now, the last thing I want to do is count words in students' papers. So, believe it or not, I actually do have better things to do with my time than that. And so, I'm not going to take points off if somebody's slightly under or slightly over that, but I'm giving you a suggested length of about 8 to 10 typed or printed pages so that you can have some idea of what I have in mind. Okay? I'm not looking for a 20 or 30 page paper. I'm looking for a paper roughly around 10 pages, give or take a little bit. Okay? So, length and form then, 8 to 10 double-spaced printed pages. Now, play fair here. You know, don't use some huge font and create huge margins with just a little trickle of text down the middle of the page. You know, I'm talking about, you know, a genuine 8 to 10 page double-spaced paper. Use footnotes or endnotes to document your sources. If you're an English student, as in English major or minor, you will probably want to use the MLA style sheet form, because that's the one that is professionally used in literature courses, and if you were to go on to graduate school in English, you would be expected to use the MLA form for documentation. But I don't insist on that. And if you're a social sciences major or an education major and you have grown up with the APA or American Psychological Association form, that's fine. It's a perfectly good form. Or any other one is fine so long as it is clear. As long as you just give me a clear reference to any source that you have relied on. And you're going to have to rely on some sources, right? I mean, if you're going to talk a little bit about the life and times of your writer, the issue that was going on in your writer's time that your writer became involved with, where are you going to get that information? You have to go to some kind of sources. And then, of course, there's going to be the literary work itself, which is going to be your primary source, right? So you're going to be needing then to give some documentation of your sources. Now be sure, and I don't want to have to repeat this, but be sure to document your sources, okay? There is never, ever, ever any reason for anybody to get involved in plagiarism. I hate even to talk about it, but it does come up sometimes. If you use somebody else's words, just put quotes around them, okay? Put quotes around somebody else's words, and then put a note in there. I got this from so-and-so. Sure, I mean, that's what we all do, by the way. That's part of scholarship. If you read articles in the journals, the historical journals, the philosophical journals, the social science journals, the literary journals, what you're going to see is people constantly citing and quoting other people. But it's part of our academic culture that we give credit where credit is due, right? If you use somebody else's words, put quotes around them, and then put in a note telling where you got it. If you picked up some information or idea from somebody else, and you're not putting it in their exact words, but you picked up the idea or the information from some source, put a note in there. Say, you know, I have gotten this information about, Charles Dickens from, so-and-so's biography of Charles Dickens, let's say. And that's fine. That's the way it works in our academic culture. It doesn't mean that your work is any less valuable or any less original. The original part of what you have to present to me is your analysis of the novel, let's say, or the play or the poem or short story. I say short stories because while unfortunately we don't really have time to do justice to James Joyce in this course, Joyce is one of the major writers of the 20th century. And we have in our anthology two of his stories, one called Araby and another one called The Dead. And The Dead is itself a classic. It's a long, short story, but it is itself a classic and would be a marvelous subject for a paper. Okay, and then at the end of your work, I would like to see a narrative bibliography. By a narrative bibliography, what I mean is not just a listing, but I want some indication from you of the usefulness of each one of these works to you in doing your topic. Okay? Was this useful or wasn't it useful? How was it useful? How was it not useful? Okay? Now, most things you're going to find useful because I hope you're not wasting your time on things that are not useful. I mean, you can glance at some things and say, oh my God, you know, that's not going to be very helpful to me. You set it aside and go on to something else. Okay? And again, if you have any questions at all, just see me or the assistant instructor. Okay, let's talk about the final examination. Obviously, another big project. A list of study questions for the final examination will be presented and discussed in the review class at the end of the course. The last class will be a review session in which I will present you with a list of study questions for the final. I will go over those questions and you will have an opportunity to ask me questions about the questions. And then, when you come in to write the final examination, all questions on the final examination will be taken from the list that you will have in advance. In other words, you will already know what questions are going to be for the final. You just won't know exactly which ones are going to be on the final until you come in to write the final exam. Okay? See, there are no tricks, no surprises, and you can use your textbook. And you can use your textbook during the final exam. I ask you not to bring in additional books, notes, and so forth, but you can bring in your textbook. And some people say, well, can I bring in a dictionary? Well, yes, you can bring in a dictionary if you find that helpful. It's okay. Okay? And we'll talk more about the final later on. But that's basically what it's going to be. In addition, there is a weekly journal. Starting the second week, you don't have to, I mean, tonight what we're doing is mainly, I'm talking about the nature of the course, the format of the course, kinds of assignments and so forth. And then we're going to take a break in a little bit. And then after the break, I'm going to begin to talk about some of the things happening in England, particularly in the beginning of the 19th century, that will provide the context for the emergence of Romanticism as a cultural movement, and in particular as a literary movement. But I'm not asking you to come up with a journal entry about that. So starting the second week, when we actually begin to take up the literature, you will turn in a journal entry giving your personal responses to the works covered that week. Personal responses. This is what you think. Okay? It's not necessarily what I think. You can agree with me or disagree with me. What I'm interested in is your personal response to that work. There's no way you can get this wrong because it is personal to you. And each entry should be a paragraph or so and no longer than a page. So I'm not trying to make a huge assignment out of this. I'm not asking you to write a long paper each week, just a journal entry. And I'm not grading these for, punctuation or spelling or something or other like that. What I'm doing here is I'm trying to get a sense of what you're thinking about when you are studying these works, okay? I mean, to a certain extent, you can tell me, those of you who are with me here, but you can tell me even more by writing in your journals. And those of you who are taking this course at a distance on television or by tape or DVD purchase, I have no way of knowing what your responses are unless you send me in your weekly journals. Okay? Yeah, question. Now, let me just say, because you're the first person who's going to be asking a question. There is in front of each of you, except I think the people on the very back row, there is a microphone. And you'll notice on the edge of that facing you, there's a little place where it says push. You have to press that down and hold it as long as you're talking in order for your voice to be heard. Okay? Go ahead.
What kind of form did you want the journal in? Or do you want us to keep a notebook or just give you like a page? Or how do you want that
Just a
done?
page, and I'm going to be telling you how to turn it in just a second. So, okay? But that's a good question. Any other questions about the journal? Yeah.
Do you want it handwritten or typed?
Well, I'm going to be telling you more about this in a moment, but you'll probably be emailing it in to me. And if you email it in, obviously you'll be typing it. You can handwrite it, though, and simply give it to me here in class. And those of you who are taking the course as a distance education class, if you want to handwrite it and mail it in, that's fine. Or those of you who come to campus anyway, you can put it in my mailbox in the English department if you want to. That's fine. But probably the most efficient way is to send it in by email. It's real easy to keep track of things that are emailed in. But I don't require that. Okay, so see, here we are. Journal entries should be emailed or sent by regular mail to the assistant instructor. And for those of you who are here with me, I'm going to be giving you a printed copy of stuff that you will need to know about the course in our next meeting. For those of you who are taking the course at a distance, if you haven't already gotten the full course description and syllabus at one of the orientation sessions, you can get it online through the distance education website. And that also has all the information about how to contact the assistant instructor by email. So please include, if you do email, please include the entry within your email message itself rather than send it as an attachment. I know it's, one of those things we automatically want to do, just click, and attach something, except that there are so many different formats in which attachments come that some of them we can open and some of them we can't open. And so it's always better to just include it within the email message itself, the text of the email itself. Is that clear? Everybody knows what I'm talking about, right? Okay. Final grade. Everybody's always concerned about grades, right? The final grade is going to be based on the 3 categories of assignment. Let me go backwards. The journal will count for 10% of your grade. So there's no way to get this wrong. If you turn the journals in each week, you get full credit. You get an A on the journal part of your grade, okay? Just by doing it. Now, notice also that 10% is a good deal, isn't it? I mean, 10% is the difference between one letter grade and another letter grade. It's the difference between an A and a B, or a B and a C, or a C and a D, and so forth. Okay? So do the journals. If you get behind, somebody always gets behind. You know, usually, I mean, I'm not going to try to pry into anybody's personal life here, but often enough in these classes, we have somebody who's about to have a baby, or, you know, somebody else has to have an operation, or, you know, there's a car accident, or God knows what can happen. I mean, sometimes life intervenes, right? And so you may miss one of the journal entries, right? If you get behind, just catch up. Don't worry about it. If you get behind, just catch up. Just make sure that you get them all in, because otherwise you will not get full credit for this part of the computation of your final grade. And then the term paper and the final examination are weighted roughly equal one to the other. Okay? Any questions about this? The weighting of the grades? All right. And then policy on course completion. Now, naturally, we don't want to see anybody withdraw. On the other hand, it does sometimes happen that somebody really needs to withdraw because, you know, as I said, you know, people have accidents, people have health problems, there may be family issues that come up that, you know, can't be resolved within the space of the semester, and somebody just gets too far behind and they don't feel they can really catch up. And yes, you can withdraw if you have to, though I would encourage you not to withdraw if at all possible. You would need to contact the assistant instructor, because the assistant instructor keeps the folders on each one of the students. Okay? So the assistant instructor would be the one for you to contact, and you'll have that person's email address, so you can contact the person by email if you wish. And of course there's a form that you're supposed to fill out when you drop the class. Now don't worry if something happens, you know, at the very tail end of the semester, and God help us, you know, nobody's going to have some terrible accident or something. But if something did happen, we can always manage to help you out at the end of the course, even at the end of the course. Okay? And then secondly, if you have a non-academic reason for requesting a grade of incomplete, please contact the assistant instructor. Now notice why I have both bolded and underlined non-academic. Most students and most teachers really feel very uncomfortable with incompletes. You know, it is an option. Sometimes it's impossible to complete a course during the regular time for one reason or another. But why I stress the word non-academic is that it really ought to be something beyond just, I've gotten behind with the reading. You know, like a health problem or a family problem, or so. I mean, you don't have to give me personal details. I'm not, you know, I'm not trying to pry into anybody's personal lives. But if you tell me this is also on the honor system, this is on the honor system, I mean, if you tell me that you or a member of your family has some kind of a health problem, fine, we will deal with that. Or some other kind of issue, we will deal with that. And I am not requiring you to have doctor's excuses. I'm not requiring you to go into any kind of personal details. Okay? This is on the honor system. Okay, so that is an option, though it's something that naturally and I hope you feel uncomfortable with, because people think, oh yeah, I can take an incomplete and I'll finish the course up in the next couple of weeks. And lo and behold, I cannot tell you how often this happens. At the end of each semester, we get a printout of all of the students in our classes who have taken incompletes, and a year has elapsed and they have not completed the incompletes, and those incompletes are about to turn automatically into Fs. It's real easy to put off. I mean, it's real easy to put off. So believe me, if there's any way that you can scramble, even if you've gotten behind, and complete the course during the regular term, it is very much to your interest. On the other hand, that is an option if you have to avail yourself of it. Okay? I mean, after all, we have to make this system as humane as we possibly can. So, any questions about any of the things that I've been talking about, having to do with the nature of the course, the format of the course, the kinds of assignments that you're going to have to do in the course? Well, I hope that this part of our presentation hasn't been too intimidating, because really, I hope that you will enjoy the course. I mean, it's actually a lot of fun. We're going to be reading some great stuff and talking about some terrific stuff, as I hope I've given you some indication of in some of the illustrations I've provided in talking about assignments. So we're going to be taking a break, and for those of you who are with me, it's going to be about 10 minutes, and then we'll come back and we'll do our second segment. Okay.